Hello, everyone. Welcome to our webinar presentation, our second Wednesday webinar presentation today. I am Rachel Savasik-Luxon. I'm the Director of Research and Training for the Dibble Institute, and I'm thrilled to welcome you all to today's webinar, Conversation Strategies for Talking with Youth About Healthy Relationships. We're so honored to have Drs. Mindy Scott and Matthew Rivas-Koehl here as our April webinar speakers. But before I introduce them and turn it over to them, I'd like to go over just a couple of housekeeping items. So if you want to go to the next slide. First thing is, if you cannot hear this presentation, please check your audio settings. They're located in the control panel. If that doesn't work, sometimes it's signing out and signing back in, or you can dial in using the phone number found in the invitation that you received for today's session. We don't have handouts for today's presentation, but we will add some resources to the recording of the webinar that will be available in a few days after the presentation. So you'll have access to the PowerPoints, a recording of today's presentation, and some additional resources that will be shared throughout the webinar today. The other thing is that the chat is currently open, so you can find that in the control panel of your Zoom platform. We'd love to hear who you are and where you're joining us from today in the chat as a welcome to everyone. I see it already starting to come through, so welcome to those of you who have said hello, and welcome to those of you who will be saying hi shortly. We will be opening and closing the chat today as our presenters have different opportunities for engagement throughout the webinar. So just kind of be aware of that. It's open now. We'll be closing it and then we'll reopen it for opportunities for engagement as we move throughout today's presentation. That is partly so that if you have questions for us or our presenters, please put them into the Q&A box. That's another reason why we open and close that chat. The Q&A box is also located in your control panel. And we just want to make sure that any questions that you have don't get lost if they are placed in the chat box. So again, any questions that you have for us or for your presenters today, please go ahead and place those in the Q&A chat. We'll have some time at the end of the presentation today where we will get to address those, or if there are others that pop up in terms of tech challenges, we'll make sure we address that as the presentation goes on. Lastly, there is closed captioning available should you choose to use it. So now that webinar tech check keeping things are over, I want to go ahead for anybody who's new to us and introduce you and tell you a little bit more about the Dibble Institute. So if we go to the next slide, what you are going to see here are our wonderful founders who gave us our name. So this is Charlie and Helen Dibble. Charlie did a lot of work with youth during his retirement, and he was seeing a lot of them having difficulties around their relationships, or when their parents were having difficulties in their relationships, it impacted those youth that he was working with. And he was a Mr. Fix-It of sorts, so he had the brilliant idea to translate research into teaching tools that could then be made widely available. So that is how the Dibble Institute was created. And while we're not a direct service provider, we develop research-based practices and make them available to folks like some of you who are here today, or maybe all of you who are here today who might be using our stuff. So the next slide is a little bit more about how the Dibble Institute has grown over time. The Dibble Institute is a national independent nonprofit organization. We have clients in all 50 states who are providing direct services. And last year, based on our conservative estimates, we believe our clients reached almost 117,000 youth based on materials purchased. So we just want to take a quick moment to say how grateful we are to all of you who are here or maybe watching the recording that are doing this really important work with young people. So just thank you for all that you do. So being an independent nonprofit organization, what guides us? First is our mission. Our mission is to empower youth and young adults with the skills to build and sustain healthy interpersonal and romantic relationships. We know that having these conversations with young people pulls a lot of levers. So pregnancy prevention, dating violence prevention, and the mental health lever, job readiness, and so much more. So in addition to our mission, we're guided by our values. And the first value that you're going to see on this next slide is that we are big believers in research. All of our programs are research-based, and we continue to strive for evaluations in our programs to demonstrate their impact and their effectiveness. This also means that updates are made to our programs as new evidence and new research comes out. And like we're doing today, we like to celebrate great research, which is why we're particularly excited about today's presentation too. Our next value is that we believe in stable, safe, and nurturing families of all different family formations. And this is our goal for young people to have them, should they choose to have them, and be raised in these families. And lastly, we believe that relationship education is for everyone. All of us can improve our relationships, and we make sure our programs are reflective of that. And we even hear that in our trainings and different sessions that we hold of folks learning new skills and taking them into their own lives. So that's a little bit about the Dibble Institute, but y'all are not here just for us. So I'll just go ahead and take a second to introduce Dr. Mindy Scott and Dr. Matthew Rivas-Koehl. Dr. Scott is a nationally recognized healthy relationship expert who conducts research and provides training and technical assistance to support the design, implementation, and evaluation of healthy relationship programs for youth and young adults. Dr. Scott currently leads Child Trends Activate Center, which is a research to practice translation center funded by the Office of Population Affairs. And Dr. Rivas-Koehl is a research scientist at Child Trends. His work focuses on adolescent well-being, healthy relationships, and translating research into practical tools for professionals who support young people. He contributes to projects that help youth-serving practitioners apply evidence in ways that are developmentally responsive, relevant, and actionable, with particular attention to the experiences of young people facing structural and social barriers. And his broader research examines how relationships, gender socialization, and sociocultural contexts shape health and well-being across the life course. So without further ado, I will go ahead and hand it over to them, and we will be closing the chat. So I'm so excited to see how many of you have written in, but it will be closing down in just a moment until we have our first engagement opportunity. So, all right, I'll hand it over.
Yeah, Rachel, and hi everyone. Thanks so much for being here. Really looking forward to the discussion today. I'm Mindy, and I'm going to start just by saying a little bit more about the Activate Center that Rachel mentioned. This Research to Practice Translation Center is led by Child Trends in partnership with Chapin Hall, and also in collaboration with a large research alliance made up of practitioners, researchers, and young people. And Activate really aims to bridge the gap between research and practice by creating research-based resources for use by professionals who support young people experiencing the justice system or child welfare system, or youth experiencing homelessness or disconnection from school and work. So really thinking about professionals working with young people who are kind of connected to different systems. The substantive focus for Activate is on translating research specifically focused on adolescent sexual and reproductive health for professionals working with youth with those experiences. But we take a broad perspective around sexual and reproductive health and include healthy relationships in that. And so today's presentation is going to provide some guidance from a compilation of resources that we've created focused on healthy relationships. And Matthew's going to say a little bit more about the plans for today, and then we'll come back to me for some of the start of the content.
All right, thanks, Mindy. So we have 3 learning objectives for this webinar. We hope after attending this webinar, you'll be able to describe key elements of healthy adolescent relationships, use practical conversation strategies to talk with youth about healthy relationships, and also help youth safely navigate digital-based relationships. So in meeting these learning objectives, our goal is to keep this information as practitioner-focused as possible. So we really want to emphasize considerations for youth supporting professionals, like Mindy said, whenever possible. So we're going to introduce information about healthy relationships. We'll share some tips about how to apply this information in practice, and then also address how some of this information and tips about healthy relationships can apply in digital settings as well. So as we move through this presentation, you'll see that we introduce concepts and then we move to how to apply them. So we're going to do that for each major concept that we cover. And throughout the presentation, we're going to ask that you answer some questions in the chat too. So our first one is here, and we'll open up the chat for this. We've heard from youth supporting professionals that we work with that it can be difficult to have healthy or have conversations with youth about healthy relationships. And we want to hear from you. Why do you think that is? Right, I see these coming in. Stigma, judgment, language.
Definitely some trust challenges.
I see age and generation gaps, social media guided point of views. All right, we'll definitely talk a little bit about that. Maybe not feeling like youth and youth supporting professionals can relate to one another, or kind of feeling, disconnected from one another. Maybe not having the same experiences. Yeah, things feeling taboo, um, feeling like it's, difficult or fearful when it comes to talking with youth. Yeah, these are really great. Um, and it makes a lot of sense. So I hope that as we talk through our webinar today, we're aiming to try to equip you both with the knowledge so you feel confident going into these conversations, but also just some tips and maybe, prompts and how to address some of the conversations. And yeah, I appreciate a lot of the nuances that you all are bringing up in the chat. And so, of course, as we go through, consider that these are sort of broad suggestions. And obviously, the context of your environments and your youth the best. So you can think about how to apply those depending on sociocultural differences, which I also see popping up here too. Yeah, thanks everyone. All right, so trying to keep that in mind as we move through. This slide gives a little bit of a roadmap for some of the key elements of healthy relationships that we're going to cover. And so on the left, you'll see that we at the Activate Center have emphasized communication, boundaries, and shared power, all as central to healthy relationships. We've also expanded upon this to explicitly include consent as another element of healthy relationships. So we're going to talk more in detail about each one of these. And of course, I have to say that these are not the only elements of healthy relationships, right? There's a lot that goes into healthy relationships, but these are kind of the buckets that we're going to cover that we think really highlights some key information. So I will hand it back over to Mindy to get us started talking about healthy communication.
Right. Yeah, thank you. And we're going to start with healthy communication and some things to keep in mind. And based on that chat, I agree with Matthew. We're going to hopefully help give some strategies to address some of these challenges just around um, kind of making young people feel comfortable, some ways that you can talk about healthy relationship dynamics without really being too intrusive with the young people and their own experiences, and really modeling some of these skills yourself. So, with healthy communication, first thinking about what does this look like? Healthy communication requires several things. Two essential components include active listening. So this is where someone's really paying attention and reflecting back what they're hearing rather than just sort of waiting for their turn to talk. Healthy communication also requires clarity, which means people say what they mean. They're very intentional. They're not expecting the other person to read their mind. And then for the other person in that conversation, this might include remembering not to try and make assumptions about what's being said, using active listening to clearly understand the other person's perspective. Effective communication also includes elements of emotional regulation, so being able to pause, come back to a conversation rather than reacting in the moment. Healthy communication might include some elements of repair if things did not go very well in a previous conversation or sort of get challenging. And we all know people do have some missteps. There might be disagreements, but what really matters is recognizing those missteps, coming back to the conversation, apologizing, compromising when needed, and working to build that trust. And so, kind of helping think about those trust concerns that you mentioned in the chat. Finally, healthy communication means sensitive topics that could include things around sex or boundaries, and trust are handled with respect, with empathy, rather than either avoiding those kinds of topics altogether or pressure or criticism. So really want to emphasize that for youth, communication is a really important life skill, and people can practice this and improve over time. And it's something that always can be modeled, including through your own interactions with young people. And so we want to talk a little bit more about some specific strategies for talking with young people about healthy communication. When you're talking with youth about relationships or really anything, and really it's important, as we've just said, to help model some of those healthy communication skills as you go. And so here are some specific sort of approaches to that. First, ask direct questions to better understand what's happening the in your conversations with young people and about their relationships rather than sort of guessing. Avoid making assumptions about what was meant, what they wanted, or how they felt. This is really important because as we're seeing through some of the chats, context really matters. And so the same behavior can mean something very different depending on the context and the specific relationship and the specific young person. Here, active listening can be especially useful. So you might say something like, "What's on the slide? What I'm hearing is that you felt ignored when that happened, that specific thing. And did I get that right?" And this really helps show respect for what the young person's saying. It helps slow down the conversation and gives the young person a chance to clarify and make sure that they're conveying, what's most important to them. When modeling these behaviors, the approach also shows you that conversations about relationships don't have to feel like an interrogation, and hopefully don't need to be awkward. That you're really trying to be collaborative and thoughtful, and really prioritizing getting to understand the perspective of the young person. A practical way to help youth think about and talk about communication or any of these issues is through scenarios. And so we have one here that we want to work through a little bit with you. But the use of scenarios will help young people practice distinguishing between healthy and unhealthy relationships, and the dynamics about relationships without immediately having to put a young person on the spot about their own particular relationship. So in this scenario, we have Jordan and Kate, and Jordan tells Kate that she should wear a certain dress to prom. And Kate wears the dress even though she does not want to because she's not sure how to discuss the issue with Jordan. We felt like this is a good example to start with. It sits in kind of a gray area that warrants conversation to just understand the situation a little bit more. So on the surface, this may seem like a small thing, but it does raise important questions about some of the other dynamics around this type of relationship. Was Kate afraid to disagree? Did she feel pressured? Was this just kind of a one-time conflict or part of a broader pattern? So on the next slide, we want to work through this a little bit more. So thinking whether this might be a sign of an unhealthy relationship. It may be just more of a matter of needing different communication skills. And in that case, professionals can certainly work with young people on building those skills to kind of talk this out. And we're going to focus right now on that piece of it, sort of talking things out. We do want to make sure we're ruling out the possibility of something more serious that could signal more relationship violence, elements of relationship violence. And we'll talk about some of those elements around shared power and coercion and control next. But let's think first of just how to distinguish whether this is more of a communication element or there's a broader pattern. And so what additional information might we want to gather to better understand the nature of this relationship? And this can be done through some follow-up questions. So we want to take just a few minutes to work through some draft questions. So if we could open up the chat again and have you draft a question that you might ask Kate in the situation for more information, and one prompt that Kate could use with Jordan to kind of better communicate Kate's position and clarify the situation with Jordan. Does this happen often? Yes, definitely exploring whether there is a pattern of these kinds of demands and from Jordan to Kate. Yeah, I think assessing kind of Kate's reaction, what made them nervous, what about the request made them uncomfortable, why did Kate feel unable to disagree with Jordan. Really like the point about assessing whether Kate would be comfortable responding back, because there may be, more serious reasons why Kate would not disagree, and we don't want to sort of push someone like Kate into a conversation that might be unsafe to follow up.
Yeah, and I like this here because it's both practicing as a youth supporting professional your communication with the youth, and then also helping them think about what how they might respond in this scenario. So I see some coming in here too, like giving Kate, some language to say, I don't like the dress, and if I don't like the dress, I won't feel comfortable wearing it. Like, hey, I really want to have a fun time with you at prom. But if I'm wearing something I'm not comfortable in, it's not going to be fun. Like, can you tell me more about why you wanted me to wear that in the first place? Or maybe we could go pick one out together, or, you know, things like that. So I'm liking some of those prompts coming in as well.
Yeah, great. And yeah, and I like the idea of thinking about the partnership working together to have more open communication and plan things together. Yeah, this is helping to get at some of the just general disposition of individuals too, whether they're comfortable voicing their priorities, their perspectives, or generally sort of do what's asked. And um, that's great. And actually, I think segueing into the next topic around shared power, we will talk about sort of elements of making sure that both partners' priorities and preferences are at least considered. And so trying to uh, empower young people to really be more mindful of their own preferences and priorities and talking about those. Um, so I think some of the questions that you all posed too help to sort of get at the overlap between communication and power imbalances. They're not the same thing, but they very clearly overlap. And so sometimes what looks like a communication issue might be more about power and control. And so when working with young people, we really want to help the young person think about not just sort of whether they're communicating with their partner, but how decisions get made. And as we're talking about whose needs and values and priorities really count in those interactions. So for shared power, for the activate resources that we have kind of defining shared power, and this is based on reviews of research and resources. Shared power means decisions are made together rather than by one person calling all the shots and kind of controlling the relationship and decisions. It means each person's needs matter. Not one person dominates or controls or punishes the other person to get their way. Uh, Importantly, this does not mean that people always want the exact same thing and that there's no conflict or disagreements in relationships. It's, perfectly normal for those disagreements to happen in healthy relationships and for people to want different things. But with shared power, it means there's room for both people's voices and preferences. And disagreements don't kind of turn toward things like control or pressure or retaliation. And so really want to kind of convey this idea to youth because it shifts from did you argue, which might be yes in any relationship, but how did the decision making process happen? Did everyone involved really have a say? So thinking about the dynamics in those discussions and decisions, including when there's an argument. All right, so thinking about some strategies for talking with youth. One thing to keep in mind is thinking about ways to provide some really concrete examples rather than keeping some of these concepts more abstract, just so shared power becomes really much easier to recognize when you can picture sort of what decision making looks like, what pressure looks like, what choice looks like in relationships. And so um, if we revisit that scenario with Jordan and Kate, we have some steps that a youth supporting professional could take to sort of explore this more. So start by listening and asking things like what happened. And these definitely reflect the questions that you all posed. How did that make you feel? Did you feel like you had a choice? Really helping to get more information from the young person of just sort of the their reaction to the situation. And then some of that active listening that we talked about, reflecting back. So once that conversation is going, kind of commenting what I'm hearing is that you felt pressured. Is that right? Here again, that reflection helps the young person feel understood, gives them a chance to confirm or clarify how you're interpreting what they're communicating, and then really exploring the young person's perspective on what they think shared power might could have looked like. And so you're hearing about the problem where there was not as much shared power potentially, but also helping you think through what they might want instead of what really happened. And here, this this guidance definitely shows the overlap between communication and shared power. The guidance that we're providing really has elements of those healthy communication skills. So just wanted to note that overlap again, and they're so related but also distinct processes. Um, so I think we're ready then to go back to Matthew, and we're going to talk about the other two elements of healthy relationships that we're going to cover today.
Great, thanks, Mindy. So I'm going to cover the concepts of boundaries and consent, and I think, as Mindy said, shared power transitions really nicely into thinking about boundaries. So shared power is partly about whether both people's needs and preferences and limits, matter in a relationship. And then boundaries helps us make that a little bit more concrete. So boundaries give us language for what feels okay, what doesn't feel okay, and then what respect looks like, in practice. So I think also discussing boundaries reminds us that healthy relationships are more than just really liking someone or really caring about someone, but it also a big part of a healthy relationship is respecting another person as their own independent person too. So boundaries, of course, vary by person, but I think it can be helpful to organize them into categories. So I have these four broad categories here. First, physical boundaries. These might seem obvious, but things like touch, affection, sex, personal space. There's also emotional boundaries. So emotional boundaries could involve, sharing certain feelings, maybe privacy around past experiences, not wanting to talk about past relationships, for example. Maybe that's a boundary that somebody has that's important to them for a particular reason. Material boundaries could include things like money, possessions, phone access. We'll talk a little bit more about that when it comes to the digital component. And then also mental or intellectual boundaries, which could, involve people's beliefs or opinions and values. Like, hey, I believe this, and I don't need you to try to change my mind about it. So, of course, not everybody is going to have the same boundaries, and that's perfectly fine. But a boundary that feels really important to one person might not be as important to another person, but it's still important that that boundary gets respected, right? And kind of tying this back, thinking about, can those boundaries be communicated well, and can they be respected? So, seeing how we're bringing in those pieces of communication and shared power still throughout. So when talking with youth about boundaries, I think it can help to start broad. Some young people might be more comfortable thinking about boundaries in friendships or family relationships or just their daily life before diving into dating relationships. And I think this harkens back to what some of y'all put in the chat about, feeling like some of these conversations are taboo or awkward or not having that trust established yet. So you can start broad to get the conversation going, and that helps too to prevent it from feeling like a test or an interrogation. So one practical strategy you can use to talk about boundaries is, like I mentioned, kind of keeping it broad or keeping it general first. You might ask about boundaries with friends or roommates, family members, classmates, things like that. this can just help you identify the concept first before attaching it to a more personal or emotionally charged or awkward context, you know? So I think it can also be helpful to give youth structured opportunities to reflect on their boundaries. Writing prompts often work well for this because they allow youth both time for reflection and they don't require personal disclosure or at least immediate personal disclosure. Maybe you can have writing activities and then people who are comfortable can share out something like that. But you might ask people, ask youth that you work with, what are deal breakers for you in a relationship? Or what is one thing you do not share, such as your clothes, or maybe it's your phone, or maybe it's your location, right? Thinking to the digital piece. So the goal here is not to force disclosure, but it is to help youth identify their own limits and begin practicing language for expressing them. So we're going to open the chat back up here, and I'm curious what questions you all might use. What might you use to ask youth to reflect on and talk about their personal boundaries? Um, I saw folks from a wide variety of professions and contexts, so I think it also is very much context dependent, right? Depending on the one-on-one interaction you have with youth, maybe you would keep it more broad. If you have a long-standing or closer relationship, you might get more personal or specific. But what are some questions that you might use here? How would you define personal space for sure? And as these are coming in, I'll also just say that, we're talking about youth today, but notice how these apply to relationships, all types of relationships throughout the life course, right? So I remember being in a conference where on our name badge, it said something about like, are you a hugger? Or, yes, I'm a hugger. Or, no, please don't hug me, right? Like boundaries, personal space, right? Yeah, have you thought about what you are and are not okay with? Ooh, what do you consider a red flag? Great. I see on social media, like TikToks and things like that, people love to call out red flags versus green flags. So maybe you can use some of that language too, right? Like, what's a red flag to you? What's a green flag?
I like the mix too of asking, more individual personal preferences, ideas versus providing some examples of relationships in general. I think you get
Mhm.
could potentially get different information that way of, might never happen to me, but if I think broadly about what young people should do or want to do, you get, maybe even more information potentially.
Yeah, definitely. I like this one a lot. How do you notice when something doesn't feel comfortable to you?
Mhm.
Absolutely. Where does that show up? Is it a red flag in your brain? Does it feel icky in your body? Like, do you tense up? Do you start sweating? Like those kinds of things. I really like that. What would you tell a friend if they came to you in the same situation? Yeah, that to Mindy's point, I think that's really a good way to kind of, take the onus off of the youth you're working with a little bit and maybe help them think broadly. Yeah, these are really great. So for the sake of time, I'm going to move on, but I love these questions. So now, now that we've talked about boundaries, I think there's a very clear link to discussing consent. And, consent is a very clear intersection of communication, power, boundaries. So boundaries help a person identify their limits, and consent is about whether there's agreement about what is happening. So, as we'll talk about here, consent is not just a one-time checkbox, but an ongoing necessary thing. So, at its core, we're going to define consent as a voluntary, informed, enthusiastic agreement. Like I said, it's ongoing, so that means it can change at any time. So, a person can agree to something and then decide that they don't want to continue. They can revoke their consent, and that is absolutely within their right and must be honored, right? Pressure or fear or maybe impairment, which could be, due to like substances, for example, or even being really tired or asleep or a side effect of a medication. All of those types of things cancel out consent because it undermines a person's ability to choose freely. Um, We'll also talk too about how consent can be communicated both verbally and non-verbally. I advocate for um, teaching folks that a combination of both verbal and non-verbal cues is best because it reduces ambiguity. And then one myth we also really want to challenge clearly is the idea that the absence of no means yes. That is not true, right? We're really working toward a definition of consent that is yes means yes. Um, so also, one important thing to remember is that we often think about consent in the context of romantic relationships and sex, but it's important across contexts, right? You would want to ask consent before you just take a bite of food off of someone's plate, or also asking consent before sharing a photo online, for example. So when talking with youth, it can kind of help to be connect consent back to real life questions like, was there a choice? Was the person informed? Was there pressure? That sort of thing. So you're kind of seeing how communication, boundaries, power are all colliding here. And when we move into talking about consent with youth, one thing that we learned from working with our research alliance is that it was really, really helpful to have examples when talking to youth about consent. So this slide provides some concrete examples of how young people might communicate consent. And so as you can see, there is not just one phrase or a perfect way of asking. And also you can see here how we've broken it down into verbal cues, nonverbal cues, and then both, a combination of using verbal and nonverbal cues. So I won't go through all of these, and these slides will be available to you soon. So, but just a couple of them, yes, I'd love to do that. Very clear, very simple. But then during an activity of any kind, saying, I really like this. I'd like to keep going, or I'd like to keep doing this, or actually, this isn't so fun anymore. I want to stop. So you can see how we're giving examples here of both consenting to an activity, but also not consenting to an activity, and how that consent can be interrupted or taken away. So I think modeling all of these and providing, examples for youth in various scenarios can be really helpful. We also linked our consent TA tool here at the bottom, so you'll also get that in the resources after the webinar that has more examples and more tips for talking specifically about consent with youth. All right, so I know we're covering a lot today. We're kind of trying to hit the high points here. We've covered concepts of healthy relationships so far. So kind of thinking about all of these together, I also think that we'd be remiss not to address how these can play out online and in digital contexts because, we're hearing so much about how important that is to talk with youth right now. So technology, we're thinking about texting, DMs, social media, FaceTimes, video calls, all of these things. Obviously, it can facilitate connection. And that goes back to that communication piece that we discussed, right? Like healthy communication practices need to also occur via technology too. Technology is used for youth to help stay in touch. It can help youth explore their identities, find new communities, maintain long distance relationships, all sorts of great things, right? But it can also expose youth to harm. And so the question here is not whether technology is good or bad. We're not going to debate that. But we do need to be aware that both healthy and unhealthy relationship dynamics can play out online. So going back to our communication, power, boundaries, and consent, these can all travel through digital platforms. So I'll say we're going to talk through some of the things for youth supporting professionals to be aware of on the next couple of slides regarding like sexual cyberbullying and red flags. But I also just want to, put out there this, it's really important to pay attention to misinformation and disinformation. And that goes for all of us too. Like just because we're adults and we are the educators in many of these scenarios doesn't mean that we are immune to mis and disinformation online. So I think it can be helpful to also communicate that to youth and say like, hey, I'm not just, like preaching to you or talking to you about these concepts. Like these are things that I, even as a professional, have to remember too, because there's so much out there online and not all of it is helpful or accurate or healthy. So we actually did a webinar with Dibble. The Activate Center did a webinar with Dibble on sexual cyberbullying in particular last year. So maybe you remember some of this content from there. But I want to just highlight, what sexual cyberbullying is, because this is something that we're increasingly concerned about with youth. So this is any type of sexually aggressive or coercive behavior that happens, via some type of electronic media. Sexual cyberbullying can have a detrimental effect on youth, on all youth, but especially those, we're thinking about the populations that we focus on and activate. So youth who have prior experiences with trauma or unstable living arrangements, maybe already lacking supportive adults. These experiences can really exacerbate some of those difficulties. So, part of our work as youth supporting professionals is helping young people recognize um, harmful digital behaviors. And so, we're going to talk through more of those here in a minute. But first, and I want to hear what are some of your most, biggest concerns regarding technology and healthy relationships right now? Maybe you've heard these from the youth you work with or just observed it. But what are things that are concerning you? Privacy, for sure. And yeah, like I said, I mean, I feel like as an adult, as a professional, as an educator, I don't know all of the ins and outs of, privacy as well. AI is a big one right now. Um, and I think helping youth, identify what is an AI generated image, like what are the telltale signs, helping youth understand what AI is and what it isn't is helpful. Tracking, sexting, pornography. Yeah, definitely. People posing or pretending to be other children or other kids, not having a limit. Yeah, so all of these things that we, might be concerned about, I think it's important to help youth, to equip youth with the tools to recognize why some of these might be concerning to them too. And so I've done not to get too far into this, but we've done some research in this area, and what we find is that youth are concerned about these things. I want to, kind of debunk the narrative that youth are totally just, on board with everything that happens with technology. I think youth are very skeptical and eager to learn about how to stay safe online. So even if it feels awkward, I really think these are important conversations to have. All right, so how do we actually talk about youth and healthy relationships in digital spaces? So I think a useful starting point is that youth understand the platforms maybe better than we do, but trying to kind of stay up to date and relate to them is important. But let's talk about some of what these behaviors could look like. So examples of sexual cyberbullying could include sextortion. This is where somebody's coerced into providing sexual images. Um, maybe this is a violation of their boundaries or, resulting from an imbalance of power. We also have online sexual harassment, so unwanted, sexual messages or inappropriate behavior in digital spaces. Non-consensual sexting, see consent coming up big here, needing to kind of have those healthy communication tools to be able to talk about consent. We also see revenge porn or sharing images of someone to humiliate or harm them. Cyber stalking, that gets at the monitoring piece that folks were identifying in the chat. And then cyber dating abuse, right? Like all of the signs of an unhealthy relationship in person can still play out online. So these are some of the things that you'd want to watch out for with youth. So we can help youth think about what healthy relationships and boundaries mean in their digital world. And here's a few concrete ways you can start these conversations. So you might ask how social media works in their relationship, asking youth about, how fast is fast enough to reply to a text, for example. Maybe there's some issues with monitoring going on there. What would you do in this scenario? It can also be helpful to give youth some ideas or examples about boundaries. So a person might say, for example, I'm not sharing my password, or hey, when I'm at work or when I'm at school, I'm busy and I'm going to respond to you later. So giving youth the language to set some boundaries. And then finally, once again, I'm just going to encourage you to encourage yourselves and youth to really look for accurate evidence-informed information because there's a lot of inaccurate or misleading messages about relationships online as well. And with that, I am going to pass it over to Mindy to wrap us up.
Yeah, we just wanted to leave you with a few final considerations to help guide your practice and work with young people. And then we'll have time for some discussion and questions. So the reminders here really just kind of meant to bring us back to the role of youth supporting professionals in all this. And to kind of help alleviate some pressure where you're not going to solve every relationship issue, especially with just select conversations. What matters is creating space for reflection, for respect, for safe decision making for the young people. When working with youth, also important to help guide them toward making healthy decisions, but at the same time respecting their autonomy, and not just kind of telling them what to do or how to feel, really respecting their feelings and their perspective. This has come up in some of the chat discussion of just meeting youth where they are, and youth are going to vary so much with respect to their understanding of healthy relationships, their own experiences and exposure to healthy and unhealthy relationships, their capacity to kind of consider the guidance, and so really taking the time to understand those contexts and meet youth sort of where they are in terms of readiness and understanding. And again, you're not going to know everything. You don't need to have all those answers. Your role is to kind of create that space, ask good questions, model respect, model healthy communication skills, and help youth sort of think through and reflect on their experiences and their preferences and needs, kind of in the moment and then going forward as well. And so we have a number of resources from the Activate Center that we drew upon for all of this content, and we wanted to provide links here, and these links will also be part of a handout available with the webinar recording. If you are excited about this Activate work, we have on maybe the next slide or two slides if you want to advance, Matthew. We have our website link here. We love to have more people follow us on LinkedIn, and also we have a newsletter that comes out every month with new resources from Activate, new topics. So really excited to have you join our community if you're interested, and you can join through these various links here. So thank you, and we have time now for any questions.
Yes, we've got time for questions, and as they start to come in, I just want to say thank you again for this presentation. And I was so excited to hear because, in the introduction, we talk about how the skills that are presented in particularly our programs, are kind of translate across lifespan and different relationships. And in hearing kind of the way y'all talked about engaging with youth and this active listening and, pausing and kind of teaching them that emotion regulation skill, all of that is what we utilize in our curricula. Those are the types of activities that we use and promote, as well as, utilizing scenarios to get them to kind of challenge their thinking and their beliefs there. So I think it's funny to hear because, again, it's like we're teaching youth these skills, but these skills are so, important too for the facilitators of these curricula or other youth serving professionals to utilize to help build these connections, establish trust, like y'all had pointed out there. And I thought it was interesting too, Matthew, you pointing out about the skepticism around technology, because Carly and I have experienced that as well when facilitating Dibble curricula of youth saying it's not real. Like there's so much out there that's inaccurate. Expressing kind of those concerns around that. So yes, the chat is disabled. That's why we've got the Q&A box open. So if you've got questions, please do send them that way. Are there handouts that we can provide our youth? So I'll let y'all answer about maybe some of the handouts that you might have available.
Yeah, we do get this question a lot. Our audience for our center is the practitioners, the professionals working with young people. So our resources aren't specifically designed for young people. However, we have heard from so many of our practice partners that they will often kind of take the content and incorporate that into their own discussions and materials for young people. So we have worked hard to make the content accessible enough that it can be shared directly with young people, even if our resources aren't quite designed for just handing over to the young people, but really are ready to be incorporated into the sort of direct practice with young people.
Well, I will say there are handouts in our program, so if you're unfamiliar with double curricula, we do encourage you after the webinar to indicate that you'd like to access a review copy so that you can see some of those resources, which, like I said, are very much in alignment with the messages and information that y'all shared today in the presentation. Next question is, do you have advice for how to talk with youth about healthy relationships when they express the belief that we don't know what we're talking about, or that dating is so different and we can't understand it?
Yeah, I this is a funny one, uh, but so real. Um, Even I teach classes with college students, and even now I realize, my examples are just so out of date with some of them. And so what my advice would be is to not try to sidestep that. Like, I think it's okay to acknowledge that and say, like, I'm much older than you. I know things were probably a lot different. Maybe you can even make a joke about it, or say something, to that end. So first naming it, addressing it, don't try to ignore it, right? But also approach the youth with curiosity. Like, help me understand. Like, I'm genuinely curious. What is it like for you? So yeah, I mean, Tinder didn't exist when I was dating, but can you tell me how it works? Like, help an old man out, right? Like, I would approach it with curiosity, and I think that um, a lot of our advice throughout this presentation, you'll see there's a lot of question prompts, and that tends to be my advice in general with working with youth is ask prompting questions as opposed to trying to, maybe give them this very specific concrete advice. I think there's a time and a place for that, sure. But I think that we can build better relationships with youth by asking questions and, kind of putting them in the expert seat and then seeing where it goes from there, responding and guiding them.
That's exactly what I was going to say. Just use that opportunity to have those conversations, learn from them. Um, for our research to practice translation, it's been so critical to have younger people help us sort of interpret and translate the research and make it though feel up to date and current. Programs themselves are using youth advisory groups to develop content to make sure the examples, you may have a kind of manualized standard curriculum, but if you can learn from the young people themselves about kind of are the examples resonating, what doesn't feel, what feels outdated, what doesn't feel current, it's just so much more valuable. So use that as an opportunity to really learn from them. I love the idea of like letting them be the experts because they really are. And things change so much. So, you're kind of constantly having to try to learn all that new information.
Change so much and so quickly too. So like you said, that genuine curiosity really makes a huge difference too. Okay, another question. I have a lot of kids confuse their needs with control. For example, I have trauma from my last relationship with cheating, so I don't let my partner be friends with girls because it triggers me. It can be tough to discuss control when a young person truly feels that this is their need that should be respected. How can I address that more successfully?
I saw that question earlier, and it made me reflect on the boundary discussions that we were having. And I know it's not necessarily in the role of all the people here today or anybody working with young people to sort of explore the history of what a young person's where they're coming from, but like just kind of thinking through and helping a young person understand why they may be behaving in a certain way. What are some of those relationship experiences and histories they're bringing to a new relationship, but also kind of the context piece. Each relationship is going to be different, and so this requires possibly levels of professionalism and therapy, for example, but like learning why you're behaving a certain way and trying to sort of not let that interfere or shape how you are with the next relationship. So I know there's levels of ability to do that, but I think it kind of comes into play around understanding boundaries and relationship experiences and how you're showing up in each unique relationship and how you're kind of expecting the partner to show up as well.
Yeah, that was my first thought too, is I think there's an opportunity here for referral, helping the youth understand, like first and foremost, where those feelings are coming from and why. I think in sort of the immediate context too about addressing this in their current relationship, I would also ask them questions about, so how is that affecting your current relationship? I know it can be really hard to have you know trauma or negative experiences spill over into new relationships, but it's also something that is important to work on. So how is that going in your relationship currently, right? So maybe slowly introducing some of those nuggets that this is something that, I mean, in this instance of cheating, obviously I don't want to be dismissive of trauma, and to Mindy's point, right, there's definitely layers and levels of intervention here depending on the context, but um, I think that youth do want to hear sometimes too when they're doing something that might not be great for their current relationship, because they do enjoy their relationships, right? We all do, hopefully. So, um, kind of starting to plant some nuggets about like, is that affecting your current relationship? Let's talk more about that. I think would be a good strategy.
Thank you. And another question, and I think I know where y'all are going to go with this, but do you suggest that youth partners talk over their boundaries proactively?
Yes,
Yeah.
definitely.
And
Uh,
building those skills for, self-empowerment, self-efficacy to really to communicate and understand and communicate your boundaries.
Awesome. And we talk about that too in our program. Sometimes you don't realize you have a boundary until the boundary is, you know, being pushed. And then all of a sudden you're like, wait a second, I have expectations around this, and I do have boundaries that need to be discussed.
Yeah,
Uh,
and I was gonna say I've seen like on social media, on TikTok, Instagram, there are, as we discussed, there's lots of negative information out there, but there's also some fun things that I've seen around like gamifying
Mhm.
discussions with your partners. There's a card game, We're Not Really Strangers, is a card game that my teenage sister actually gave to me as a gift, and I thought it was really cute. But like I think that there is, again, an openness to having these conversations to where it's important to say, like, I know some of these things feel awkward. It can feel awkward to talk about, but like, look at the fun ways that you can improve your relationship by doing so as well.
Awesome. Okay, let's see. I think at this point we only have one more time for one more question. Do you have ready to post healthy relationship graphics or posts that can be shared on social media, different organizations' social media?
Um, on our LinkedIn page, we'll have sort of little snippets, kind of did you know sound bites from the full resources, and we're going to be doing that even more, um, with the idea of having more easy to share kind of content. So we're actually producing sort of a full curriculum of our materials that's going to include really those short takeaways and already designed social media friendly visuals and graphics and messages. So stay tuned for more of that, but you can see what you can grab from our LinkedIn page already.
I'll plug two child, like are presenting on behalf of the Activate Center as part of Child Trends, and also Child Trends as a whole, I think does a good job of, especially lately, we're really trying to put out some of those social media tidbits too. So if you don't follow Child Trends on, LinkedIn or other social media, I would say that would be a good place to look as well.
Awesome. Well, thank y'all so much. There are a couple of questions. If we didn't get to your questions, don't worry. We've got them. We'll make sure that we follow up after today's presentation. We've got our presenters' information here. We also will have after the webinar, so please keep your browser open because there will be a survey that pops up automatically. We appreciate your feedback. This also gives you the opportunity to ask any questions you might not have been able to ask, and also request those review copies because, like I said, a lot of the topics and discussions that we had here, and even some of the questions that we talked about, are really integrated throughout our program content. So if this is new to you or we're new to you, I encourage you to request those for your review copies. Like I said, the webinar will be available within 3 days. We'll have the slides available as well and a link to some of the resources that were discussed. So some of those links that were discussed today for y'all to explore. If you need a certificate of completion for today's webinar, please feel free to email kim@dibblesinstitute.org. And lastly, we hope you join us for next month's webinar. So that'll be on May 13th. It's the Dating Recession Insights from the 2025 National Dating Landscape Survey by Dr. Alan Hawkins. Thank y'all for being here today. Thank you, Mindy. Thank you, Matthew. We appreciate you sharing this really useful and powerful information. And we hope to see everybody here next month. Have a great one.
Everybody,
Bye.
take care. Bye.